Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final episode of our special series for Cell and Gene, the podcast called FDA Fridays. My guest for this episode is regulatory affairs expert Daniela Drago. She's partner at NDA Partners, and Daniela joins me to unpack how changes at the FDA and CBER may shape the future of cell and gene therapy. Now, when we launched this special series 4 weeks ago with episode 1 featuring Dr. Kay Spratt, Dr. George Tidmarsh had just taken over as acting head of CBER due to Dr. Vinay Prasad's departure. Now, at the time of my recording with Daniela, Dr. Tidmarsh was still acting head, and you'll hear Daniela speak of him. Now, as of August 9th, 2025, Dr. Vinay Prasad has resumed his role following that brief departure. Against this backdrop of leadership transitions and shifting policy priorities, Daniela shares her spot-on perspective on what sponsors should anticipate in the near term, from expedited review mechanisms to the evolving use of real-world evidence and digital health integration. She also offers actionable insight on how cell and gene therapy developers can prepare for regulatory uncertainty while continuing to meet FDA expectations around safety, efficacy, and manufacturing rigor. I want to thank all of you for tuning in to all 4 episodes in this important series featuring Kay Spratt, Monica Svetlika, Bambi Grilli, and now Daniela Drago. The series was designed to spotlight some of the most influential regulatory experts in our space as they offer clarity and guidance at a time when the cell and gene therapy regulatory landscape is evolving rapidly, and to help set the tone for future innovation and conversation. And so without further ado, here's my conversation with Daniela Drago. Enjoy. Daniela, hi, welcome to this very special series of Cell and Gene, the podcast that I'm calling FDA Fridays. And so I'm thrilled that you have been able to give us your time and your expertise. And so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me here, Erin. I'm excited.
Good. So I want to talk a little bit about the current administration, the federal administration, and how it's shaping healthcare policy and regulatory priorities. So many people in the cell and gene therapy space are, of course, closely watching for shifts within FDA and specifically, of course, CBER. And where there have been changes to leadership, perhaps changes to, within the actual therapies themselves and in their progress. And so what I'd like to hear from you is, have you observed any notable shifts in FDA or CBER priorities under the current administration or that could impact the development or approval timelines for cell and gene therapy products?
Yes, Erin. And we are seeing, I think, 2 big things that are happening at once. On the one hand, the scientific priorities at FDA and specifically at CBER have not substantially changed. Mm-hmm. They are still really intensely focused on robust evidence generation. And for cell and gene therapies specifically, there is still a lot of attention that is being paid to manufacturing consistency and chemistry, manufacturing, and control in general. But the biggest story, Erin, is a significant leadership crisis that is causing a great deal of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And this is evolving rapidly. So let me just say that at the time when we are recording this episode, the former head of CBER, Dr. Prasad, recently resigned, right, and reportedly under political pressure. And this obviously has currently still left a leadership gap. To fill it, the FDA has asked the new director of CDER, Dr. Tidmarsh, to also run CBER temporarily. And while he's really highly regarded, he has no prior government experience and is now responsible for 2 of the agency's most complex centers. So realistically, This means that CBER's focus, at least for a while until things will settle, will be maintaining daily operations. And anything that is requiring high-level strategic engagement will likely be delayed. So I expect work on new policies or big initiatives to likely be put on hold.
Sure, sure. And that makes a lot of sense. And so, um, with regard to how changes within the regulatory leadership or strategic focus at the FDA, uh, how might that impact long-term planning or investment for cell and gene therapy developers and sponsors? Considering, as you said, I mean, Dr. Tidmarsh is, you know, he's going to be focused on the daily and common, which is great, but perhaps, what about long-term planning? How are we going to be impacted in that way?
Yeah, well, this adds a big new risk for everyone in the field, which is really political volatility. That's what's happening, and the risk that is added. So when you picture companies investing hundreds of millions of dollars over many years, they depend on predictability, Erin. I'm sure you hear that from many others. And so the reports of an ousting of FDA center director for political reasons sends a little bit of a worrying signal. And it suggests that political pressures can override the scientific judgment at the agency. And so this also imposes a signal that scientific leadership is not as insulated as in the past from political winds. And what I hear from investors, clients, developers is that this is unsettling and it makes it much harder to plan for the long term. So I think what the best mitigation strategy, if you want, for companies and entrepreneurs in the cell and gene therapy field remains unchanged, though, because it's important to focus on what you can control and make sure that your science is solid and your manufacturing and control processes are robust. So this means investing in strong science, developing a deep understanding of your product's mechanism of action, and establishing phase-appropriate methods from day one. I think it goes a long way to say that a well-characterized, high-quality product is really the best defense against uncertainty, and it will be well-positioned to succeed regardless of who is leading the agency.
Sure, that's a very accurate, fair statement. Now, that's sort of a long-term outlook. Would you say the same applies to even a short-term outlook, over the next 1 to 2 years while the current administration is still with us? So how might evolving leadership or even policy directives within HHS or FDA affect regulatory guidance specific to cell and gene therapies while we're still within this term window?
Yes. As you might recall, Aris, I'm sure you do as well as your audience, the CBER's guidance agenda for 2025 was actually issued before the change in administration. And that list contained, I believe, 14 guidance documents towards cell and gene therapies on several topics. I recall, for example, platform technologies in gene therapy products incorporating genome editing, post-approval methods to capture safety and efficacy data, and safety testing of human allogeneic cells expanded for use in cell-based products. But now, Erin, the reality, I think, is that we should not expect to see much new guidances from the FDA for the next couple of years. And there are several reasons for this. But the two key ones are, first, that there is a new deregulation mandate coming really from the top. So for every one new guidance document that the FDA would issue, it's now required to withdraw 10 old ones. And this policy alone dramatically slows down new guidance development.
Sure.
And then, second, the FDA itself has fewer people to do the work. The agency has seen significant staff reductions with major cuts to the new policy teams who write guidance documents. And so at the same time, regulatory policy is also being centralized at the HHS level. And this means that there is more being driven by the political priorities of HHS leadership and less by scientific staff within CBER.
Okay. Earlier, you mentioned funding, and I want to talk a little bit about funding allocations and public health priorities that are influencing how CBER resources are being deployed. So, from your perspective, is there any indication that funding in general, particularly around cell and gene therapy review capacity or perhaps innovation programs, is there any sort of influence about how CBER resources are being deployed?
That's such a crucial question, I find, Erin. And so I really appreciate your bringing this up because I think the answer has shifted dramatically in recent months. First, let's address the funding. It might surprise you to learn that actually CBER's problem is not a lack of money, but as reported, for example, most recently by the Pink Sheet and others, the FDA recently decided not to increase industry user fees for the upcoming year, even with an exploding workload. And the reason is that the agency already has a large surplus of funds that it cannot spend. And the real bottleneck is people. Mm-hmm. The FDA is facing right now an exodus of senior staff and other staff, and is struggling to hire qualified experts fast enough to keep up. I think also important to highlight that we are seeing a shift in public health priorities dictated from the top of HHS. And so, as reported also most recently by Stat News and others, the HHS secretary most recently announced that the government's emergency preparedness agency will no longer fund work on mRNA vaccine research. And so BARDA, for example, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, is terminating more than 20 grants supporting the development of mRNA vaccines. That means, to answer your questions directly, CBER's resources are being squeezed by a shortage of staff, and a new layer of political oversight is redirecting national health priorities. So experts in the field expect this combination of factors to slow down the review process and put some uncertainties also in the support for innovation programs across the cell and gene therapy sector.
So with all of the the reduction of staff, whether there's kind of resignation, forced resignation, however you want to say it, what are there are short-term impacts, and of course there are long-term ripple effects for cell and gene therapy developers. Can you talk us through a little bit about short-term, what are we looking at due to reduced staff, and whether that be pilot programs, expedited review mechanisms, that type of thing. And then what the long-term ripple effects could be for cell and gene therapy developers.
Yes. The immediate short-term impact is uncertainty, as we discussed earlier, and a potential slowdown in any non-essential CBER activity. These will likely be put on the back burner. So pilot programs may continue, but their broader impact might be more muted. And the long-term effects are really the ones that are the most concerning to many. The primary danger, I think, or what I hear from many, is that it's a degradation of expertise at the agency. If the FDA is perceived as a place where science is secondary to politics, it's going to be challenging to recruit and retrain a certain type of talent. And so this could lead potentially to a long-term decline in the quality and consistency of regulatory oversight in the US. People in the field fear this potential erosion of the FDA's credibility because the FDA's authority for many really rests on its reputation as an independent, science-driven institution. And if it starts to be seen as an arm of a political agenda, its decisions might lose weight, and this might happen both in the US domestically as well as globally. And so this is a risk that affects patients, sponsors, and really the entire biopharmaceutical ecosystem.
So would you say, so thank you for that. And I was jumping around a little bit. I want to go back and talk about updates or trends in regulatory modernization. So we're talking digital health integration, real world evidence, decentralized trial models, that type of thing, that cell and gene therapy sponsors should be tracking more closely, kind of given what's going on in the climate.
Absolutely, Erin. Companies should really, even more now than in the past, keep tracking and using modern tools like, as you mentioned, digital health trackers, more flexible clinical trial designs, and so on. These are not going to go away. But I think it would be prudent also to temper the expectations that a company might have for the FDA's ability to lead on these fronts in the near term. The current environment is likely to slow down a bit the agency's ability to issue clear guidance or launch new pilot programs in many different areas. We might see some, but there is uncertainty. And so some of the things that the cell and gene therapy sponsors can do are to, for example, really thoroughly understand and operationalize the current FDA's decentralized clinical trials guidance for designing more flexible and patient-centric trials if it's applicable to their program. Ensure that the digital health tools and decentralized elements are robustly validated with clear oversight and there is compliance with regulatory data standards. And then monitor FDA and CBER communications for updates around platform technologies, adaptive trial models, and evolving CMC standards, especially for innovations that are targeting rare diseases.
Great advice. Finally, before I let you go, from your perspective, how can cell and gene therapy sponsors who are listening best prepare for or respond to potential regulatory shifts while still maintaining within the FDA expectations for safety, efficacy, and that type of thing? You've already given such a great list of best practices, but I guess if we can talk a little bit about any shifts that they happen quite often as of late, and so what would you tell our sponsors listening how to best prepare for or respond to potential regulatory shifts?
Yeah. With all this uncertainty, I think that the smartest thing to do is kind of get back to basics. And so I would recommend focusing on three things. First, make sure that you focus on your CMC. A robust, well-documented manufacturing process and a solid analytical package is really a good shield. Second, keep talking to the agency, but be very strategic. Understand that the current environment is a bit tricky. So, given the current climate, sponsors must be prepared for more challenging interactions. And in some cases, working through academic consortia or patient advocacy groups that share the industry's objectives may be an interesting and effective strategy. Also, for formal PDUFA meetings, such as pre-INDs or interact meetings, it's even more critical to be concise and clear in your communication. So make sure you present only relevant data, organize the information well, and highlight what are your key messages to make the reviewer's job easier. And then finally, I think as a third point, it's critical even more today than in the past to develop and maintain a clear target product profile and to think of a plan for the entire product lifecycle. This ensures better internal disciplines and building a product on a foundation of quality and rigor that can resist better external pressures. So in short, it's important to control what you can control, which is the quality of your science and your product.
Great. And I think that that's such great advice, even when we're not in a period of perhaps uncertainty, to make sure that you are very tight with all of the engagement with the FDA, start early and make sure that all of your ducks are in a row, for the lack of a better way to say it. That should be the way it is, regardless of what's kind of going on with the uncertainty in the space right now. So I think that's also a great takeaway for our listeners. Well, that wraps up this episode for our special series, FDA Fridays, featuring regulatory expert Daniela Drago. Daniela, thank you so much for your time. This was a really thoughtful conversation, and I'm so glad you were the one that I had it with, and I appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you, Erin.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in, and we will see you right here on Cell and Gene, the podcast, next time. And we'll talk to you soon.